The American story was once seen as a light of strength and freedom for the world. It created a government by the people and for the people, where rights were given not by leaders, but by God. Yet now the very fabric of the nation is under assault. What is the real story of America? Why did the Founding Fathers choose a republic over a democracy? And what would the world be if the bedrock of the American Constitution was lost? All right, welcome back, everyone. So, as you just saw in that trailer, we are releasing very soon a special feature about the Constitution. Something that I would say, and I think many would agree, is becoming much more relevant right now, especially the attacks against it, what's happening with it. And I think also trying to clear up some of the history of what America really is. Our new documentary or special feature, America Rewritten, is going to be debuting on Epoch TV on July 6th. Folks, so tune in for that. As you just saw the trailer on it, just announced it. I think you're really going to like it. Have some other great stuff in the works. If you're wondering why I've been on the road so much, that was one of the reasons. One of the reasons. More coming soon, we'll see. But folks, I hope you really enjoy it. That said, a few of you are asking, before we get started, about Epoch TV. We're going to be doing for now, so we've been listening to your feedback. There have been some tech issues on Epoch TV. I do apologize for that. We're trying to launch this thing, working out some of the tech issues. We should have it down hopefully soon. But I know some of you folks have been unhappy that we've been dividing the show between YouTube and Epoch TV. We're going to find a good solution for that. But for now, we're just going to do the lives when they debut on YouTube. And so, folks, you're going to get the full live Q&A on YouTube. We'll do the whole things here. We'll post to Epoch TV afterwards. And our exclusives, the interviews, and also the special features, like the one you just saw, America Rewritten. Those are going to be exclusively on Epoch TV. All right, folks, that said, some big stories to go into tonight. I want to talk about what's happening with China and Taiwan and Japan and a few other countries. Taiwan, as we speak, really is gearing up, in their own words, for a possible conflict with the Chinese Communist Party. They're making it very clear now that they can't take lightly the threats of the CCP. The Chinese Communist Party is threatening to, retake Taiwan, aka wage war on Taiwan, and forcefully try to seize land from them, namely their country. And they're saying now that they understand this, they need to take it seriously, and they begin to prepare for it. Now, as this happens, there's been a big question over whether other countries would actually step in to help Taiwan, were that to happen. Now, some analysis would say Taiwan by itself could actually give the Chinese Communist Party a pretty serious run for its money. But, of course, they're a small island nation against China, the Chinese Communist Party, one of the largest powers in the world. And so a big question would be, would the United States step in? Would Australia step in? Would other countries step in? Well, Japan appears to be stepping forward now and saying that they must defend Taiwan if it comes down to it. And they're encouraging other powers to do the same. This is important in context of the Quad Alliance, America, Japan, India, and Australia, and their commitment for defense in that region. And also it's going to be making a lot of other countries have to choose where they stand, let's say. All right, folks, these stories, a lot more to come. Again, we're going to do the full episode here on YouTube, so we're not going to cut to Epoch TV. We will put this on Epoch TV afterwards. And again, we have exclusives coming there as well. So, folks, stick around. Some great stuff in the works. That said, folks, good to see you all here. Yeah. Thanks for being here, folks. Always appreciate you all. Always good seeing you here. Yeah. DM Fuerte, thank you. Yeah, folks, appreciate you all. Yeah, LLC, prayers for Taiwan. Marie, yeah. And real quick to note, too, we're not going to abandon Epoch TV by any means. We have a lot of good stuff in the works, some big programs in the works. We're also going to find a better balance with the lives between Epoch TV and YouTube. Something that makes everyone happy. But again, we've been listening to feedback, and we want to work out some issues and get it running smooth. That said, folks, let's start with the first stories for the night. Now, I want to start what's happening with Taiwan. Now, it's actually CNN reports, and forgive me, right? Bear with me, folks. It's CNN, but they have the exclusive. What are you going to do, right? All right, CNN reports. Taiwan's foreign minister says we need to prepare for military conflict with China. It says here, China's escalating military intimidation of Taiwan shows the self-governed island needs to prepare for a possible military conflict. Taiwan's foreign minister, Joseph Wu, said in an exclusive interview with CNN. I know, folks, bear with me. He said, as Taiwan's decision, this is Wu telling this to them. He says, as Taiwan decision makers, we cannot take any chances. We have to be prepared. And continued stating, when the Chinese government is saying they would not renounce the use of force and they conduct military exercises around Taiwan, we would rather believe that it is real. And so there you have the Taiwanese foreign minister saying now that they need to take seriously the threats from the Chinese Communist Party and saying that they should start preparing for a possible war with the CCP. This rumored conflict, the one everyone's been kind of wondering whether it's going to happen or not, I'd say right now feels closer than ever. And folks, let's go into a bit more of this. First, as I mentioned before, Crossroads is totally demonetized on YouTube. And that's just why we don't have super chats. It's why we don't have advertisements. It's also why we had to go and build our own platform, Epoch TV, which, again, some great stuff in the works there. Again, America Rewritten, the trailer you just saw is going to be there. A few others in the works, some big stuff coming up. But folks, luckily we do have some sponsors. And tonight's episode is brought to you by American Hartford Gold. Now, with all the turbulence in the economy, multi-trillion dollars in spending, the Chinese Communist Party waging currency war, Chinese companies may be being audited very soon on the stock market, which is going to create a lot of interesting friction when it comes to international finance. And folks, with all this, say, unpredictability with possible inflation, with the stock markets, you can consider investing in an asset that tends to be both stable and on the incline. That's gold and silver. Now, American Hartford Gold is one of the highest rated firms in the country with an A+ rating from the Better Business Bureau. They can have your gold and silver delivered right to your doorstep or into your IRA. To learn more about them, you can check out the link in the description below. American Hartford Gold has provided a free 25-page information guide. And so if you're just curious about how to invest in gold, check it out, have a look at it, see what you think of it. It's free in the description below. And if you call them now, you can get up to $1,500 of free silver in all qualifying first orders. The phone number is 877-260-2764. You can also text Joshua to 65532. And on that note, if you want to see what they look like, this is one of the smaller gold bars. These are some of the silver coins you can get. Here's a gold coin, actually. And actually, this is one of the, 10 ounces of silver. Real nice bar. Good weight to it. Really, if you feel it, it has real nice weight to it. All right, folks. Let's jump into the next stories for the night. And again, big thanks to American Hartford Gold for making tonight's episode possible. Now, on the note of Taiwan, right, we just talked about how Taiwan's foreign minister is saying that they need to possibly prepare for a war with China. What's happening right now, again, the big question is, would other countries get behind them? And here you have Japan stepping in. Japan's minister is saying it's necessary. They're saying it's necessary to wake up to protect Taiwan. Reuters reports this one. It says Japan's deputy defense minister, deputy defense minister, on Monday warned of the growing threat posed by Chinese and Russian collaboration and said it was necessary to wake up to Beijing's pressure on Taiwan and protect the island as a democratic country. Now, speaking to the Hudson Institute think tank, State Minister of Defense Yasuhide Nakayama questioned whether the decision of many countries, including Japan and the United States, to follow a one-China policy that has recognized Beijing rather than Taipei since the 1970s would stand the test of time. And folks, The significance of this cannot be understated. To put it lightly, right? He's saying that the United States, Japan, and other countries have basically they've recognized the one China policy. Do you know what that is? This is the CCP's policy claiming ownership over Taiwan, essentially. It used to be the case, as I've mentioned previously, that Taiwan was recognized as the government in exile of China. Taiwan was the official government of China after the Chinese Communist Party took over. That's where the Kuomintang went. That was the Nationalist Party. They were the ones who took the island of Formosa as they fled the country, and they were the official government of China. Now, the Chinese Communist Party has gradually taken that over globally to the extent that even the United States recognizes it as such. But for the CCP, this ties directly to its legitimacy. This ties directly to whether the CCP is regarded by the international community and by its own people as having legitimate power. Now, for the Chinese people, they would argue, if you talk to many of the ones who don't like the CCP, that the Chinese Communist Party never had the mandate of heaven. This is something in traditional Chinese culture that would basically say you are a legitimate leader. In the West, we have legitimate election systems, and those who win legitimate elections are the legitimate leader. If you don't win, you're an illegitimate leader. For the Chinese Communist Party, for China, they have the mandate of heaven. The Chinese Communist Party in their system never had the mandate of heaven, and so it's not regarded as an official system. Now, for the Chinese Communist Party, the one China policy is one of the cornerstones of one of the main things it forces in other countries when it comes to diplomacy. If you want to work with the CCP, so I have like hair on my face or something. When you want to work with the CCP diplomatically, you have to play by some of the basic rules or they get up and they walk out of the room. This is one of the ways that they make a lot of different countries basically abide by their censorship policies. They have no-go topics, 5 no-go topics. Those are the persecution of Falun Gong, the persecution of Tibetans or Tibetan independence. That is the persecution, say one China policy when it comes to Taiwan. That's China's ownership of Hong Kong, democracy, and so on. And also has to do with other human rights abuses. Now, if you talk about these issues, it used to be the case that the CCP would basically get up and walk out of the room. Now that countries are basically saying they're not going to play by this anymore. They're not playing this game anymore. This is a serious move against the CCP. Now, the Japanese deputy defense minister continued stating this. Was it right, talking about recognizing the one China policy? He says, I don't know. And he said democratic countries had to protect each other and noted that he had in the past referred to Taiwan as a red line. He said, so we have to protect Taiwan as a democratic country. Hear that, folks? That is the shot over the bow. We have to protect Taiwan as a democratic country. Country, not province of China, country, and protect Taiwan. Both of these are serious statements when coming from any leader, let alone Japan, which is very close regionally to China, and also is seen as a pretty major power. Really, they got rid of a lot of the restrictions on their military growth that were put into place after World War II, after the CCP started making, incursions into their territorial waters. This is a really big deal, especially in context of the CCP making threats, and especially in context of Taiwan saying they need to prepare for war. This is the Japanese deputy defense minister stating, right, that he's recognizing Taiwan as a country. He's saying here, right, democratic countries had to protect each other, right? We had to protect Taiwan as a democratic country, not province. He's saying Taiwan is a country. That alone is already stating he's recognizing Taiwan rather than, say, the CCP's version of the narrative as the one China policy, that they regard Taiwan as part of China. And he's also, again, suggesting that they defend Taiwan if a conflict were to take place. This is serious, again, because this is diplomatically, this is a line most countries will never cross. Even in the U.S., Mike Pompeo, under Trump, I would say had pretty good China policies. He was pretty strong against the CCP. Even he didn't go so far as to really say whether the U.S. would defend Taiwan if it came down to it. Now you have Japan stepping up. Now, on this note, Nakayama noted that Japan and Taiwan were geographically close and added that if something happened in Taiwan, it would affect Japan's Okinawa prefecture, where U.S. forces and their families are based. Nakayama highlighted growing threats posed by China in space, in missile technology, in the cyber domain, and in nuclear and conventional forces, and said that under Xi Jinping's leadership, it had aggressive thought and will. Is a continuation of the statement. Aggressive, and continued thought and will. And he said, so wake up. We have to wake up. Now, we'll have to see what happens with this. If this is adopted as official policy in Japan, that's a huge deal. If this is adopted as official policy in any other place, that's a huge deal. If a major country, like were to support this in Japan, is a pretty major player, that's a big deal. And keep in mind that Japan is part of this whole Quad alliance, right? This new defensive alliance formed under the Trump administration that has been maintained under the Biden administration, which is specifically Japan, Australia, India, and the United States. If Japan, as being part of this defensive alliance, decides to defend Taiwan, and again throws itself into a conflict with the rest of the Quad alliance, come to Japan's defense. You see? Wars in the past, world wars started like this. Look at the way that World War I started, right? It's oftentimes, right, these complicated alliances. One tiny powder keg goes off and the whole world gets pulled in. This is where it's heading, folks. Now, we'll have to see what happens with it. There's also a lot of other questions as well. Would Russia end up siding with the CCP? Especially if they don't believe they could win. We'll have to see. Would other countries like North Korea, would, for example, Iran, would Latin American countries? Probably not. We'll have to see, folks. But you do have alliances being formed. You do have defensive alliances. And you do have those lines starting to get pretty shaky when it comes to the red lines that should not be crossed. And a good note, too, right? China, the Chinese Communist Party, is talking about forcefully retaking Taiwan, right? Forcefully taking Taiwan. Right? Taiwan is technically the real government of China, right? They don't want to recognize that, and they're afraid of that. And so they want to take Taiwan, they want to end that. And the question is now, will the rest of the world stand by Taiwan? Now, folks, on this note, a few other things are happening which could give us some of those answers, possibly. Interesting story here. This is Epoch Times reporting. It says, brutalizing its own population was hard written into the CCP's core DNA. Now, this is from a bipartisan resolution condemning the Chinese Communist Party's atrocities over its 100 years since its founding. This is not just a criticism of the Chinese Communist Party of what it's doing now. This is a criticism of the Chinese Communist Party from the very beginning up until now. The CCP is celebrating right now its 100th anniversary, the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Communist Party. And as this happens, there's now a bipartisan resolution condemning that history. Let's go into it. It says, and this is important too because it ties to what we're talking about. It says, as the Chinese Communist Party prepares, that's the CCP again, prepares to celebrate its 100th anniversary this week, bipartisan lawmakers introduced a resolution on June 25th condemning a century of gross human rights abuses perpetuated by the regime against its own citizens. The resolution, led by Representative Mike Gallagher, that's a Republican, lists more than 30 atrocities committed by the CCP from the 1930s to today, and vows that the United States will stand with the Chinese people in their struggle for liberty. That's a quote. The United States will stand with the, quote, Chinese people in their struggle for liberty. That's a big statement, right? Among the atrocities highlighted in the resolution were a series of disastrous campaigns helmed by the CCP's first leader, Mao Zedong. They include a massive land reform movement in the 1940s that saw millions of landlords and others deemed to be bourgeoisie beaten and murdered. The Great Leap Forward industrial plan, which sought to rapidly develop China's steel production to British or American levels, but resulted in modern history's worst man-made disaster, with tens of millions of people dying of starvation. And the Cultural Revolution that saw the arbitrary arrest, torture, and execution of up to tens of millions of citizens deemed to be counter-revolutionaries. The CCP's bloody military suppression of unarmed student protesters during the Tiananmen Square massacre, as well as its ongoing clampdowns in Xinjiang and Hong Kong, were also referenced in the bill. Gallagher noted that the regime's abuses in Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and Tibet today, and I'd add to that Inner Mongolia, and I'd add to that their own people as well, Christians, Falun Gong practitioners, Catholics, and others. They say that those specifically Xinjiang, Tibet, and Hong Kong are not a new development. And it states, quote, "From the very start, brutalizing its own people was hardwired into the CCP's core DNA. To understand where the party is going, we must first understand its past." And he wrote that in a June 25th Twitter post. Now, take this in context. The whole picture is the big thing here, right? You have Taiwan stating they need to prepare for a war with China. You have Japan stating that they need to defend Taiwan were that to happen. And you have the United States now, bipartisan resolution, condemning the Chinese Communist Party for its entire history. Remember the context of its entire history, right? The CCP is not the legitimate government of China. It never was. The Kuomintang technically was, which fled to the island of Formosa and established Taiwan. If the CCP is seen as a brutal and illegitimate government, and if the United States is taking one step to that and recognizing it as a brutal government that has persecuted its own people, this is really laying down the fields, right? This is really laying things down where they should be, in my opinion. But this is recognizing the Chinese Communist Party for what it is now. A brutal, suppressive, totalitarian regime that has killed somewhere between 50 million and 70 million people just under Mao Zedong, not to mention the ongoing persecutions today. And folks, another interesting part to this is where the United Nations stands on this. Let's go into this. Hear this out, folks. Get this. And we've talked about this a little bit before, but there's new information coming out on it. United Nations body collaborating with the CCP agency known for human rights violations, according to a rights group. Now, remember in a recent episode where we talked, I think last episode, where we talked about how the Chinese Communist Party was, quote unquote, disappearing tens of thousands of people, including foreigners, including non-Chinese people from other countries, tens of thousands disappearing, put in what they call black jails, gulags essentially. Turns out, folks, the United Nations is helping them do that. Let's go into it. Epoch Times reports a United Nations body set up to combat drugs and corruption is being questioned for having entered into an agreement with a Chinese extrajudicial agency known for its human rights violations. Madrid-based human rights group Safeguard Defenders announced on June 29th a new investigation into China's secretive detention system known as Liu G, as well as the submission of its investigative findings to the UN Special Procedures, which consists of special rapporteurs and expert working groups. It says the group calls the Liu G system a legalized system of disappearance. The rights group's concerns centered around how the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, this is an office on drugs and crime under the United Nations, UNODC, chose to work with a Chinese agency behind the Liu Jai system. In other words, folks, the UNODC, this branch of the United Nations that's supposed to be focused on drugs and crime, is working with a Chinese agency that is disappearing, putting people in gulags, tens of thousands of people, including foreigners. The United Nations is playing a role in this, possibly. We talked about some of this before, that they've actually reported people, including people who were set to testify to the United Nations. The United Nations has reported their names in the past. These people have been reported. Some of them were disappeared. Some of them were killed. We've written about this before. We talked about on the show before. Now, on that note, right? Again, right, chose to work with the Chinese agency behind the Liu Jai system, which is the National Supervision Commission, or NSC. Now, the two signed a memorandum of understanding, an MOU, in October 2019. And since that month, folks, the NSC, that branch of the Chinese Communist Party, has subjected at least 28,983 victims to this system, this black jail system, this gulag, the Liu Jai system, according to estimates by the rights group. Now, during the same time span, the Chinese regime only confirmed to have placed 5,909 people under the system. The rights group also estimated that a minimum average of 16 to 76 people, 76 up to a day, right, are subjected to the Lujai system every single day. And the rights group stated this. They said the NSC is responsible for widespread and systematic acts of enforced disappearance, torture, and other inhumane acts of a similar character, intentionally causing great suffering or serious injury to body or to mental or physical health, gross human rights violations that have all been reported to the United Nations. So, folks, as things are being lined up, organizations, countries, even businesses are showing where they stand. Then we talked just last episode, actually, how Nike came out and said they are of China and for China, right? You have businesses deciding where they stand. You have countries deciding where they stand. You have international bodies deciding where they stand. And with the United Nations, especially, if the United Nations is engaging with an organization that is disappearing people, engaging in torture, engaging in genocide, possibly, and all the things the United Nations was allegedly started to stop from happening. Well, folks, what does the UN become, right? Now, we've mentioned before on this show, and Epoch Times has reported, in fact, there's a great reporter who did that named Alex Newman, fantastic work, great reporter, check out his stuff, Alex Newman. He did an exclusive story for Epoch Times a while back about this, where there was a whistleblower in the United Nations that one of the human rights groups at the United Nations reported that there were people who went to testify to the United Nations. The United Nations human rights body reported those people's names to the Chinese Communist Party. These were people persecuted by the CCP. And the United Nations, as these people were trying to make their stories public, the United Nations reported them to the CCP. Some of them were stopped from traveling. Some of them were arrested. Some of them disappeared. Some of them were killed or died in custody, whatever you want to call it. And folks, as that happened, of course, what happens afterwards? With this whistleblower who warned about this, right? A whistleblower who warned about this, what happens? The whistleblower got put on a tribunal. The United Nations punished the whistleblower for making that public. Now, on that note, folks, a couple other points with this. Then we're going to go into questions after this, and I'm going to go over what's happening with the election investigations. A couple notes on this when it comes to where the cards are kind of landing right now. Russia just launched its largest submarine in 30 years. It's like a mothership submarine, nuclear submarine. U.S. forces came under fire in Syria following airstrikes against Iran-backed militia. And this is important. And then North Korea is also engaging with China again with trade. Now, the Chinese Communist Party works very close with Russia, works very close with Iran, works very close with North Korea. And it seems that this body of organizations is doing things in their own way. Now, Russia's kind of reigniting some of the conflicts with Ukraine. Iran is kind of reigniting a lot of the terror wars. Keep in mind, folks, a lot of terrorism is state-backed, and a lot of it's just, the groups we're fighting on the ground are just puppets being played by strings by larger organizations. Those organizations seem to be working again like clockwork. And the conflicts that we saw before Trump came in, we saw some of them what happened to ISIS under Trump, right? Those conflicts appear to be coming back to the extent that they're even attacking U.S. forces. Now, this is important in the broader context, as we've discussed before on the show, that there was statements from top-level CCP officials stating publicly that their intention is to get the United States involved in 4 different wars. They believe that if the United States is not properly, let's say, distracted by different conflicts, that the United States would be too much of an adversary for China. They want to start 4 wars. Now, what will those wars be? They did mention the war on terror. And they did mention trying to start a war with Brazil, which was a very strange thing. We can assume that was before Bolsonaro came into power, because Bolsonaro tended to lead more towards the United States. That was part of their intention. That fell through, as the individuals even stated. But folks, keep an eye out, because the CCP has stated its intention to ignite 4 different wars as it tries to launch its own war. And so we see the brewing stages of something happening. Whether this will come to fruition, whether it'll actually happen, we'll have to see, because the world right now is very strange, as I'm sure you've all seen, and it's hard to predict anything right about now. But we do see things lining up. We do see the lines being drawn. We do see the militarization happen. We do see the defensive alliances taking place. We do see people in organizations and countries positioning themselves in unique ways that typically happen before a large war starts. Let's put it that way. Now, folks, that said, let's jump into some questions for the night. And again, if you have questions, leave them in the chat. We'll try to get to them. Before we jump into that, though, folks, I want to show you a quick trailer of what we're working on over at Epoch TV. And again, folks, Epoch TV, again, we started our new platform. This is how we're basically keeping Crossroads running going forward. We have a lot of good stuff in the works. As I mentioned, the America Rewritten special feature is coming up on July 6th, just a few days away. Some great stuff in the works. We also have a lot of really great exclusive interviews. I'll show you a quick preview of that now.
People don't want to agree to disagree. They want you to fall into the fold, to fall in line. And if you're not 100% committed or devoted to what they believe, then all of a sudden you are a racist, you are crazy, you're a bigot, you're whatever you want to put the name on it. You look at Martin Luther King, right? He said, I don't want to judge somebody by the color of their skin, but the content of their character. Where did that come from? That is based in scripture. That's based in a biblical worldview. To treat people not just how they look, not just for their politics, but because of how they act. So let's be kind to ourselves and realize, like, what can we learn from each other? And we're not all going to agree all the time, unfortunately. But that is why I do think conservatives have to be bold in the truth and not be afraid to speak the truth. Don't let them silence you just because they disagree.
All right, folks, again, that's epochtv.com/crossroads. Please check it out. We have the link in the description below. We also have the link in the chat, epochtv.com/crossroads. You want to support Crossroads, please sign up for Epoch TV. You want to go the extra mile, you can tell a friend or a family member about Epoch TV. A lot of this is going to grow through just grassroots support, folks. And so we really appreciate your support. And again, we have our exclusive interviews there. We also have some special features there. Again, America Rewritten coming out on July 6th. A few others in the works. Keep you all updated on that. We're also bringing on a lot of different shows I think you really like. That said, folks, let's jump into the first questions for the night. Let's see here. First off, just real quick, Michael Gramps, you said, why is Epoch pushing the jab? So if you read the Epoch Times website, you'll know that we have content about the vaccines that kind of show both sides of the argument. We're not really pro or anti, but we don't shy away from showing the truth. So, we'll show you information about the vaccines that people are promoting. We'll also show you information about it that shows the dangers against people saying it's bad. We'll show you both sides, folks. That's kind of our stance with the vaccine. We'll give you the information. You can make up your own mind whether you want it or not. That's generally, I think, our stance with it. We're just giving you the information, and we're not going to censor ourselves one way or the other with it. We're going to give you the information. You can make up your mind. This is from Tony Goza. He said, is Epoch Times Hong Kong in danger like what happened to Apple Daily? Yeah, so folks, Epoch Times, we're in 33 countries, 23 languages. I have trouble keeping up with it, to be honest. But we do have an office or a printing press in Hong Kong. We're also in Taiwan. We're blacklisted in mainland China, as you might imagine. Actually, in the early days when Epoch Times first started, we did have an office in China that was kind of operating underground. Our entire office was arrested. Our editor was actually arrested as well, who was there. Spent 10 years in prison, and they tortured him. There was actually some human rights reports about that when he got out around 2010-ish. But folks, we are concerned about what's happening in Hong Kong, especially as it relates to our staff there. We've had many attacks against our office in Hong Kong previously, usually people trying to break into the printing press, trying to destroy the printer. But recently we saw 3 pretty serious attacks. The first one, a group of thugs went in and set our printing press on fire. Soon after that, we had a group of thugs go in there and smash our printing press with sledgehammers and then scatter debris over the conveyor belts and stuff to try to break the whole system. And then we also, folks, had one of our staff members, reporters in Hong Kong. One of them, an individual tried stabbing the person, one of our staff, and a person intervened and actually grabbed the knife and saved our reporter. And then another one recently where one of our staff members was beaten by a man with a baseball bat. It was a woman who was beaten. And so, folks, we are concerned about what's happening in Hong Kong. A bit of background on that. So the Chinese Communist Party ended Hong Kong's autonomy. Hong Kong was it was technically part of China. They had the one China, two systems policy. Remember Hong Kong used to be a colony of the UK, right, of the United Kingdom. It was handed off to the Chinese Communist Party under an agreement with certain terms, namely that Hong Kong was supposed to have a democratic system, and including all the rights we have in the West, free speech, freedom of the press, and so on. The Chinese Communist Party ended that. And again, remember all the Hong Kong protests, the 2 million plus people protesting on the streets of Hong Kong who tried to stop this from happening? Well, folks, the Chinese Communist Party did end Hong Kong's autonomy, and now we're starting to see the rights of the people being stripped from them. Recently, now in Hong Kong, there's really only two independent Chinese media. There was Apple Daily, and there's Epoch Times. And recently, the Chinese Communist Party sent its thugs to go to the office of Apple Daily. They arrested a lot of people there, including all the top executives. And Apple Daily announced they'd be shutting down in Hong Kong. And so the question is now, what will happen to Epoch Times in Hong Kong now that we're the last man standing when it comes to independent media, right? Now, when it comes to that, folks, we'll have to see what happens. Our staff in Hong Kong have stated that they are not going to give up. They're not going to fold. There's two options for them, and they're holding their ground with it. Pretty much, they're going to keep speaking the truth, or they're going to be arrested. But for the CCP, that would be a big move, because Epoch Times is not a Hong Kong media. Epoch Times is a New York-based media. We were founded by Chinese Americans in the United States who escaped communism in China. And to go after the Epoch Times wouldn't just be something that would anger the United States. It would anger a whole lot of countries, because again, we're in 33 countries, 23 languages. It would be a big move if the CCP were daring enough to go after Epoch Times in Hong Kong. And luckily, our brave staff there are continuing to speak the truth and report the truth. And they're not planning to stop. Next question here is from Blaze Guerra. He said, Josh, can you ever sing a converse of the one China policy? That is, could you ever see Taiwan prevailing and being the government over China if the CCP falls? Well, that's a really interesting question. This is hypothetical, of course. It's analysis at this point because it's predictive, right? So take it for what it's worth. But, in terms of mandate of heaven, in terms of legitimacy of rule for the Chinese people, Taiwan actually already has that. Taiwan would actually be in a very interesting position to reestablish government over China. The problem is, folks, that the Kuomintang, which ironically was the party that was formerly anti-CCP, ended up becoming pro-CCP. They actually lost in the last election. But the anti-CCP party prevailed in Taiwan. But, one big question is always there when it comes to what would happen if the Chinese Communist Party collapsed. And ironically, it's actually one of the things the CCP's agents of influence have tried to tell a lot of policymakers abroad, that a destabilized China, even if the CCP fell, the CCP, even though it kills tens of millions of people, they claim that it brings stability to China and so on like that, right? The big question is what would happen if the Chinese Communist Party fell? Now, a good example of this is to look at what happened with the Soviet Union. And what happens, folks? What happens, right? In the Soviet Union, who had all the money? It was the Communist Party leaders, right? The heads of state had all the money. All the Communist Party leaders had all the money. What did they do when the Communist Party collapsed? The people who had all the money went and bought all the companies, all the land, all the businesses, and they became the oligarchy. The same people who ruled the country under the Soviet system continued to rule the country because they were the ones with the money, and they just bought control of all the assets. And then you had the intelligence services, the KGB, who became the Russian mafia because they were murderers and they were killers and they were people who had no moral compass. who have no hesitation to do things to make their buck at the end of the day. Going from doing that to going to organized crime was a very simple step. That's a lesson for countries as they move on from a totalitarian communist system. You cannot have a collapse of a communist system without having some kind of retribution, without having, your Nuremberg trials, so to speak. When the Nazis collapsed, you had the Nuremberg trials, you had the denazification process, where the people who committed the crimes of the regime were put on trial. That never happened under communism. No communist leaders ever had their equivalent of the Nuremberg trial. Communism was never put on trial in the world. Not only that, we had groups like the Frankfurt School rebrand the entire idea of socialism and so on. Rebrand, ironically, the entire idea of fascism to try to dislocate it from socialism. And it was a socialist system. Tried to change the narrative of all these things and talk about race politics rather than actual socialist policy, which is what they were. The world would need to, if the CCP were to collapse, and needs to anyway, in my opinion, have a real, coming to terms with what communism is, this brutal, murderous, totalitarian system. And those who've supported it, those who've participated in its abuses, those who led its systems, those who carried out its atrocities need to be put on trial. Nothing short of that would ever prevent these countries from just having the same people come into power once again. Without these things happening, without these steps taking place, you would have the same thing that happened in Russia, where the same people in power remain in power just through other means, right? Now, Taiwan is positioned to do that. The question is whether they could do it, and especially whether the Chinese people would recognize that. Now, even a lot of anti-communist party, mainland Chinese would not want Taiwan to be the government of China. There's a lot of funny issues with them going back a long time. Even different regions of China, like the Cantonese and the other parts of China. I mean, they don't really get along with each other, even historically. There's a lot of tension between them. And so the chances are the Chinese mainlanders would have trouble recognizing that, even if they were anti-communist. And so maybe Taiwan could play a role in it. It would be hard to do, in my analysis. But I do think that if the Chinese Communist Party were to collapse, the only way to do it successfully is you'd need to have an equivalent of both the Nuremberg trials and of the denazification movement just against communism. Now, let's go over a couple more questions, and we'll jump to what's happening with the elections, the election investigations, I should say. Let's see. This is from Dan Paul Sticka. He said, any updates on the CCP defector to the DIA? So, folks, there's a lot of talk. We haven't seen direct confirmation of it yet, but a top Chinese intelligence official, Chinese Communist Party intelligence official, defected to the United States, allegedly. Now, to put this into context, imagine if under Trump, like James Comey had defected to China. This is hypothetical. He didn't do that, as far as I know. Imagine if that had happened, right? Like one of your top level heads of intelligence departments defects to China, right? That's kind of the equivalent right now of what the CCP is facing. This is important for a couple reasons. One is that, well, for the CCP, let's talk about the global side of this first. From one side of this, on the global scale, you had a top level intelligence official defect to the United States. And who is he talking to? The DIA, Defense Intelligence, right? This is military intelligence, not just normal intelligence. This isn't FBI. This isn't like government side. This isn't CIA he's talking to. He's talking to the DIA, defense. Now, what does that suggest? Maybe he has information relevant to national defense. Maybe this is a defense issue and not a diplomatic issue, and not an intelligence issue. This is a defense issue. Now, we're not actually going to know what comes out from this. I would love to interview the guy. I would love to. In fact, I've tried to. I can't get close. Probably this individual is not going to be able to do any public statements until it gets cleared by the U.S. government at this time, because the individual who defected went to the U.S. government, and specifically to the DIA. Now, the important part in this, and we don't really know what they're talking about. We don't really know what he's talking about. Well, we can assume that if it's defense related and it affects this very sensitive time for the CCP, when the CCP is talking about starting 4 different wars and talking about attacking Taiwan, maybe the individual just hypothetically might have something related to Chinese Communist Party war programs, which would be why the individual goes to the Defense Intelligence Agency. Your guess is as good as mine, folks, but I think this is possible. Yeah, Bossy Billy saying biowarfare can be very subtle. Yeah. Well, the CCP has talked about using biowar before. In fact, some of its reports talking about using biowarfare being made public now. And so they're making their rounds, folks. Love to see what happens with it. Now, the other side of this, that's one side of it. That's the internal side of it. The external side of it. The internal side of it's the other part. Now, Xi Jinping, what does he do after this happens? First of all, they deny it's happening. They deny this individual defected. Everything's fine, right? Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. Nothing's going on, right? And then meanwhile, what does the CCP do? They start making all the top members of the Communist Party give their loyalty oaths, retake their loyalty oaths. And then they say that there's a traitor, that there's possible betrayal within their midst. Now, whether this individual was a traitor, whether someone was, traitor for the CCP, whether they need to retake their loyalty oaths because this individual defected, or whether the CCP is simply afraid that the example of this may cause others to defect, is yet to be seen. But folks, you have a lot of people in China right now, top-level CCP members who are left with a choice. And I've been mentioning these kind of choices a lot, right? You have a lot of these CCP officials being left with a choice now. If they're going to be outed and possibly incriminated by information that's now being released, if these individuals are part of a plan, let's say, that this individual who may have defected is now revealing to the world community, especially the DIA, they have a choice, folks. Face sanctions. If the CCP collapses, maybe face something worse, maybe face the equivalent of like Nuremberg trials, or while that tiny window is still open, do they defect to the West? And do they say, I saw it happen, I wanted nothing to do with it, here's what I knew, please don't put me on the electric chair, let me hang from the gallows, right? This is essentially where things are going, folks. Now, we see the writing on the wall, we see things happening, we see all the different signs that something behind the scenes is happening. We'll have to see what comes out from it, because we don't have a lot of solid answers yet. But folks, I will give you updates on this as we get more information. All right, now that said, let's go into what's happening with the election investigations. We've been talking about this a lot. Oh, by the way, the drink tonight is chai tea. A very nice chai tea. My dad got it for me, actually. All right. Now, folks, let's go into what's happening with the election investigations. Now, first off, now you might have seen recently, I talked about this. The Department of Justice is actually going after Georgia right now because Georgia recently made new election laws that strengthen the election system, things like voter ID and other things. The Department of Justice is now suing, right? They have a lawsuit. The Department of Justice is now going after Georgia, the state of Georgia, for strengthening its election laws under the banner claiming that things like voter ID are racist. Now, folks, how many of you believe that people of other races can't get driver's licenses? How many of you believe that if you get carded for buying liquor or cigarettes that it's racist? How many of you believe that if you go to the airport and you want to check into the plane and they ask for your ID, that the person asking for your ID is being racist because people of other races are somehow unable to get IDs? Do you think that a person driving a car and not having an ID is, that it's racist if they have to have a driver's license? This is essentially the narrative they're going on with this whole ID thing, because the voter ID thing is actually just usually any form of verifiable ID. It can be a driver's license. It can be many other things like that, just a way of saying that you are who you say you are. The Department of Justice is trying to sue right now and saying they're going to continue suing, basically using that narrative. And we see a few different parts of this. This is acting on a few different areas. Let's go into it. Now, first of all, Epoch Times reports, Georgia Attorney General denounces DOJ lawsuit against Georgia election law is blatantly political. Now, Georgia Attorney General Chris Carr took aim at the Department of Justice recently. The Department of Justice has recently announced lawsuit against the state's election law, calling the move constitutionally wrong and politically motivated. That's the Attorney General saying that the Department of Justice is being constitutionally wrong and politically motivated. Now, under the Constitution, folks, under the Constitution, where do the systems of how you run your elections fall? Who determines how your elections are done? It's the states. It's not the federal government. This is not the jurisdiction of the federal government. In fact, not only just states, folks, but the state legislature. We'll have to see how this goes, but it's going a bit more. It says, in a Monday interview on Fox News, Carr objected to Friday's decision by the DOJ, Department of Justice, to file a lawsuit against Georgia over the state's recently passed Election Integrity Act, arguing that this blatantly political action taken by the United States Department of Justice is factually, legally, and constitutionally wrong, while alleging that the Department of Justice was being, quote, weaponized. Now, a few parts on this. We'll have to see whether the Department of Justice, well, it's the challenge, folks, right? You're fighting the system that controls the system sometimes. You know, this is one of the things that a lot of folks, you know, unfortunately, my new setup is my books are just out of reach. Otherwise, I'd pull off the shelf one of my favorite books, which I show you pretty often, Frederick Bastiat's The Law, where Frederick Bastiat, during the time of the French Revolution and so on, actually warned about this. And I mean, the book on another bookshelf, not in the shot, but Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. This was warned about, folks, that when the judiciary, when the court systems become politicized, you no longer have a non-biased judicial system. It's at that point that you risk falling into a state of aristocracy, that essentially government policy becomes the law. What the government does is what's right or wrong, and there's no written law outside of government action, right? The basis of whether something is good or bad is based on whether the government says it's good or bad. If the government says one thing is legal today and illegal tomorrow, well, folks, that's just how it is. The difference between written law, right, constitutional law in this case, a law that cannot be changed even through government action, and a system where law works at the basically is the arm of the government, is very different. The concern with this is, I'd say, and this is what Frederick Bastiat noted in The Law, right? The concern with this is, how do you have the system of justice being both the one challenging states while at the same time being the power that determines the way the courts are run? This is the Department of Justice, the one that runs these systems, bringing these lawsuits forward against the states, and you know, very, very likely to, I mean, it's no secret that our court system in the U.S. is very politicized, right? Typically, judges will vote very close to which party placed them. If it's a Democrat judge, they're going to vote more in line with the Democrats. If it's a Republican judge, they typically vote more in line with Republicans, right? We have a deeply politicized legal system. And if it goes up to the Supreme Court, we'll have to see whether they even choose to hear it. This will very likely go up to the Supreme Court. Now, on this note, the other issue you're having, folks, is that if the Department of Justice tries to block changes made to the election system, especially leading up to 2022, this isn't that far away, right? 2022 with the midterm elections, where the House and the Senate are going to be up for re-election, basically, and where Trump and many Republicans are basically trying to retake the House and the Senate, saying, and really showing a lot of grounds on doing so. And you have a lot of states now changing election laws, mostly putting stronger election systems in place, and also getting rid of a lot of the programs and policies that allowed for fraud and other problems to take place during the last elections, right? As that takes place, you have the Department of Justice trying to step in to basically stop this from happening. The big question is going to be, can the Department of Justice put a hold on these laws? In other words, stop through the use of lawsuits, put a hold on the laws locally in the states from passing until it goes to the Supreme Court? Can they do that, or how will the courts rule on that? We'll have to see. Also, can they do this before the 2022 elections, right? Big questions to be answered, folks. Now, the Constitution is actually very clear on it. The elections are handled by the state legislature. And the question is whether the politicized legal system would rule as such. Lot of questions to be answered, folks. Actually, on that note, we showed the trailer earlier for the special feature we're going to be debuting on Epoch TV on July 6th. That's America Rewritten. And in that, I'm going to go, I actually go pretty deep into the Constitution and laws exactly like this. I think anybody who watches that special feature is going to have a very good idea of how this country is supposed to function in terms of how the founding fathers envisioned it. Now, another story here. Arizona's Maricopa County will replace all its voting machines after the audit is finished. Now, Maricopa County in Arizona, they're having this large-scale election audit, not just on the election, the voting machines, but also on ballot signatures, verification, the scanning of the ballots. They're doing all kinds of stuff. Now, it's actually Democrats saying right now that they want to go into the system and basically make sure that new machines are put in afterwards to ensure that the people doing the audits didn't tamper with the machines, which is fair in my opinion, right? You have a lot of people working with machines. I personally wouldn't want to use an election machine that someone had been tampering with. But let's go into what's happening with this. It says authorities in Maricopa County, Arizona, announced they'll replace all voting machines following a Senate-ordered audit of the county's 2020 election results. The Maricopa County Board of Supervisors, which oversees elections in the county, issued a response to a letter sent by Arizona Secretary of State Katie Hobbs, saying the county shares her concerns that the integrity and security of the Dominion voting system machines and ballots might have been compromised during the audit. Accordingly, she says, I will write to notify you that Maricopa County will not use the subpoenaed election equipment in any future election, said the letter dated Monday. And in a news release, the county pledged to never use equipment that could pose a risk to free and fair elections, suggesting that the auditors may have compromised the machines. Now, that's assuming something. There's no evidence the auditors have compromised the machines in any way. But, again, they have been investigating them. They have been going to the codes and stuff like this. That does pose a credible area of concern. Let's put it that way. Now, love to see what happens with it, folks. Again, right now as we speak, you do have the election audit in Arizona wrapping up. They're going to be continuing on to other parts of the audit next. Now, recently they were saying that the audit would be the audit would be finished very soon, but the report from the audit would be out in August. And so a lot of people were thinking the report from the audit is going to be out in August. They've now moved it back, possibly. They're now saying August or later. They're saying weeks or months. And so we're probably not going to see the report from the audit soon. It's going to be at least a month, maybe longer. I guess that's kind of soon, right? But it's going to be at least a month or longer before we see the results from the investigation. Now, as that happens, though, I mentioned that states are changing their election laws. You have a lot of states putting new standards in place. At the same time, you actually have a lot of states talking about replicating the same type of audit that's being done right now in Arizona, Maricopa County. You have, I believe, 18 states now saying that sent representatives to Arizona to check out how they're doing it. And if they can get it past their own systems internally, their own political systems, you could see these audits spread to a lot of different states, possibly 18, but very likely at least a few. Very likely at least a few. And really, folks, the findings from these audits are going to show people maybe a lot. Now, when it comes to these audit folks, there's going to be a lot, I think, in my analysis, I think there's going to be a lot of debate, let's say publicly, over what happens if information is released. And in my analysis, I think this is going to unfold as such. That very likely, whether there's fraud or not, you're going to have the reports come out. You're going to have, well, let's say if there's fraud, if they do find fraud, you're going to have the reports come out. You're going to have the Department of Justice file lawsuits, very likely as they've already begun, against them, alleging in some ways, as they've already tried this, alleging in some ways that maybe there were problems with the way the investigations were done. They've already tried this. And also alleging that maybe other things, we'll have to see. There's going to be challenges, legal challenges to that. You can very likely count on a lot of the legacy news outlets to also follow that narrative, very likely just based on the way they've aligned themselves already. If you have the Department of Justice and the major news agencies, all the different legacy news outlets aligning similarly on that, you're going to have this very large ideological smokescreen, keeping the people who may vote for the systems that tend to be within that system continue to vote on that, while people who may vote against it continue to vote against it. But you're going to have something very interesting, which is that public knowledge is going to become a thing. Public knowledge, as people watch the findings of the audits and reports coming out and discourse and discussions on the grassroots level, where people can look at the hard evidence themselves very likely, and based on that hard evidence, decide whether they believe it or disbelieve it. There's going to be a very large, in my analysis, a very large narrative debate around this, going well into 2022 and very likely into 2024. Because, folks, again, this ties to the very fabric of the election system. It ties to the way the media have played things up. It ties to the whole January 6th narrative. It ties to Trump. It ties to media bias. It ties to the Department of Justice trying to prevent changes to election laws that would strengthen our election systems. There's a lot of different forces aligning over this. And in my analysis, I would say we're at the very beginning of watching this storm unfold. Now, on that note, and I know it's getting late, so I'll end it soon, but the Supreme Court is also coming close to, and is very likely going to rule on ballot harvesting. So I have to see what happens with that. But folks, I won't go too deep into it tonight. Let's end it there. It's getting late. And again, I'll be keeping you all updated on these stories as they come out. Again, those of you who are on Epoch TV, I apologize, folks. We've been having some tech issues. Basically, long story short, we tested the system was working great, but we didn't take in mind scaling, and this, basically the systems couldn't handle everyone all at once. And so we're working on sorting that out. It should be fixed soon. We've also been listening to your feedback, folks, and I know we've been dividing the episodes between YouTube and Epoch TV. We're going to work on a better solution going forward, because I personally don't like doing that either. We'll have a better solution for that. I think you'll like it. That said, folks, we have some great features coming up on Epoch TV, great interviews, and again, keep an eye out for it. July 6th, one of these special features I've been working on, America Rewritten, has now been announced. Please check it out. I think you're really going to like it. And folks, as always, please take care of yourselves, stay informed, and stay free. Thank you. The American story was once seen as a light of strength and freedom for the world. It created a government by the people and for the people, where rights were given not by leaders, but by God. Yet now the very fabric of the nation is under assault. What is the real story of America? Why did the Founding Fathers choose a republic over a democracy? And what would the world be if the bedrock of the American Constitution was lost?